On a crisp autumn morning in the quiet town of Ashford, Connecticut, the Whitfields looked like the family you'd envy. The kind of family that belonged in glossy real estate brochures and community newsletters, smiling with that effortless warmth people imagined but rarely found. Michael Whitfield, at 42, had the air of someone who'd figured out life's secret recipe. Always in a neatly pressed shirt, his dark hair perfectly combed, he was the kind of man who remembered your name after meeting you once, who knew exactly when to laugh during small talk, and who never failed to compliment your garden, even if it was full of weeds. Every morning, as the school bus rolled down Hawthorne Drive, Michael would be out front, coffee mug in hand, waving to the kids and trading a cheerful "morning" with passing neighbors. It was almost cinematic, the way sunlight seemed to catch the steam from his mug just so, turning it into a little halo of warmth. His lawn was a point of pride, lush, emerald green, and trimmed with the precision of a golf course fairway. Even the edges were perfect, as though each blade of grass had been individually inspected. If you passed by in the evenings, you might catch him kneeling down with gardening shears, snipping at a stray dandelion like a surgeon removing a tumor. Inside, the family dynamic seemed equally enviable. Claire, 38, was the softer half of the pair, a part-time elementary school teacher with a quiet demeanor that made people lean in when she spoke. Her students adored her for her patience and her way of making even shy kids feel heard. Together, they had 2 children, Emma, 12, a bright, imaginative girl who was always sketching in the margins of her notebooks, and Noah, 9, a bundle of restless energy who could never pass a puddle without jumping into it. Then there was Max, the golden retriever with a coat so glossy it looked like spun gold in the sun, whose entire mission in life seemed to be spreading joy. From the outside, they were the picture of suburban perfection. A white picket fence wrapped the property like a frame around a painting. In spring, tulips bloomed in neat rows along the walkway. In winter, Christmas lights were strung with an architect's precision, glowing softly against fresh snow. But behind the flawless facade, small fissures had begun to form, so small that even those closest to them could barely sense them. It started with whispers, things only the most observant friends noticed. Claire wearing long sleeves in the middle of July, even when the humidity clung to the skin like a second layer. Michael answering questions directed at her, sometimes before she had the chance to open her mouth. The way she would laugh, too quickly, too softly, when neighbors made light-hearted comments about his strict nature. At first, these details were easy to dismiss. People told themselves it was just the Whitfields' dynamic, some couples had their quirks. But quietly, in moments when no one else was watching, Claire's eyes would sometimes drift toward the floor when Michael spoke, her smile lingering just a second too long, like it had been painted on. In November of 2018, the subtle unease began to solidify into something darker. Claire's older sister, Melanie, had been folding laundry on an unremarkable Tuesday evening when her phone buzzed. The caller ID lit up with Claire's name. She didn't pick up right away, her hands were full and the dryer was still running. By the time she reached the phone, it had gone to voicemail. Melanie pressed play. What she heard made her stop breathing. "I need to talk to you, something's wrong. But don't call me back, I'll explain later." The words were quiet, rushed, almost swallowed by the sound of a door creaking in the background. Claire's voice trembled, not the way someone's does when they're sad, but the way it does when every syllable feels dangerous. And then, nothing. Claire never called again. For the next few days, Melanie tried to convince herself it was nothing. Maybe Claire had a bad day at work. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. But that single sentence played in her mind like a looping recording, each replay pulling her deeper into unease. Melanie called. No answer. She texted. Nothing. When she finally reached Claire a week later, her sister's tone was normal. Too normal. The kind of normal that felt rehearsed. She laughed off the voicemail, saying she didn't even remember leaving it. Maybe she'd pocket-dialed. Maybe she'd been overreacting to something silly. But Melanie didn't buy it. Not entirely. She remembered the way their mother used to tell them, growing up, you can hear the truth in someone's pauses. And Claire's pauses, those moments of silence between her sentences, were louder than her words. In Ashford, nothing seemed amiss. The Whitfields still attended every school fundraiser. Michael still stood at the edge of the lawn each morning, waving as buses passed. The family still went to church on Sundays, sitting in the third pew from the front, hands neatly folded. But if you looked closely, closer than most dared, you might notice that Claire's eyes rarely met Michael's anymore. And on some mornings, as the bus pulled away, Michael's wave lingered just a second too long, as if he knew people were watching. That November marked the start of something the town would later struggle to reconcile. Because when the truth about the Whitfields finally came out, it wouldn't just shatter their carefully curated image, it would shake Ashford to its core. January in Ashford was the kind of cold that made the air feel brittle, as if one sharp movement might shatter it. The streets were rimmed with frost, and the early mornings carried that muffled silence that comes after fresh snowfall. On the morning of January 14, 2019, the teacher's lounge at Ashford Elementary buzzed softly with the usual Monday chatter, the scrape of chairs, the hiss of the coffee machine, the shuffle of lesson plans. But one chair stayed empty. Claire Whitfield's. At first, no one thought much of it. Teachers missed work all the time, a bad cold, a sick child, car trouble. But by mid-morning, her absence began to feel strange. Claire was the type who gave notice for everything. A cough, a dentist appointment, even a migraine, she'd send a text, apologizing for the inconvenience. That morning, there had been nothing. No call. No text. No email. Her coworker, Janet Lewis, tried to brush off the unease building in her chest. Still, between classes, she dialed Claire's cell. It rang, then went to voicemail. She tried again later. Same thing. By the end of the day, whispers had started. Had anyone heard from Claire? Did she call out? Was she sick? At the Whitfield home, Michael already had an explanation ready. To the neighbors who saw him outside that evening, bundled in a heavy coat, shoveling the driveway, he explained it casually. She's gone to Maine to visit her mother. Needed a little space. He'd say it with a small, understanding smile, the kind meant to signal that this was private, but not alarming. She's been a bit stressed. You know, anxiety and all that. This'll be good for her. The way he said anxiety, like it was an excuse, not an illness, made some people tilt their heads. But most nodded politely. After all, Michael Whitfield had a reputation for keeping things under control. There was just one problem. Claire's mother, living in a small coastal town in Maine, hadn't spoken to her daughter in months. When Janet's worry deepened into something she couldn't ignore, she quietly reached out to Melanie, Claire's sister. The two compared notes, neither had heard from Claire in days. Then weeks. And the story Michael was telling them didn't line up. By January 20th, the family had had enough. Melanie filed a missing person report. That Sunday afternoon, 2 uniformed officers arrived at the Whitfield home. The house looked postcard perfect in the pale winter sunlight, but inside, the air felt different. Michael answered the door promptly, his expression polite, almost rehearsed. "Yes, officers, I've been expecting you," he said, ushering them into the living room. He spoke in calm, measured sentences. Claire had been overwhelmed, burnt out. She'd left of her own accord. She just needed time alone. And, he added, she'd be mortified if the police made a big deal out of it. The more he talked, the more it sounded like a prepared speech. Then one of the officers noticed it, a faint, sour odor drifting in from somewhere beyond the living room. When they followed it, they found themselves in the garage. The smell was stronger here, mingling with the cold air and the faint hum of a chest freezer in the corner. Michael caught them looking. "Ah, that," he said with a dismissive wave. I've been meaning to clean it out. Some old meat went bad. You know how it is." He even chuckled softly, as though it were an embarrassing but harmless domestic oversight. The officers exchanged a glance. They didn't have probable cause to push further, but they weren't convinced. Back inside, as they continued their questions, another red flag emerged. Michael's story about the night Claire supposedly left kept shifting. In one version, she'd packed an overnight bag and kissed the kids goodbye while they were still awake. In another, she'd left after they were asleep, slipping out without a word. Sometimes he said she'd taken her car. Other times, he said she'd called for a ride. The changes were subtle, but in police work, subtlety matters. They left without making an arrest, but as they pulled away, one of the officers made a quiet note in the report. Odor in garage. Inconsistent statements. Recommend follow-up. From that moment, the Whitfield home, once the neighborhood's picture of stability, became a silent focal point of suspicion. Neighbors who used to wave now lingered at their windows, watching. The children's laughter in the yard seemed less frequent. Michael's waves, once friendly, now felt like a performance. And in the garage, that faint, sour smell continued to linger. 2 weeks after Claire Whitfield was officially reported missing, the investigation had reached that frustrating stage detectives dread: too many questions, not enough answers. Leads had been chased down and gone cold. Tips from the public fizzled out. And Michael Whitfield's calm, unwavering story still didn't sit right. Then, a break came, not from a witness, not from a confession, but from technology. Police had subpoenaed Claire's phone records, combing through call logs, text histories, and the all-important cell tower data. When the report came back, one detail glared like a beacon. Claire's phone had last pinged near the Whitfield home, not in Maine, not on the interstate, not anywhere close to where Michael claimed she had gone, but right there, within a few hundred yards of the neat white house on Hawthorne Drive. Even more damning, that ping occurred hours after Michael said she had left. That was enough for a judge. Armed with a search warrant, investigators returned to the Whitfield home, this time, not for polite conversation. The day was cold and gray, the kind of sky that made colors look washed out, and the street outside the Whitfields was lined with unmarked vehicles. Detectives moved with quiet precision, photographing every room before touching a thing. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, holding their breath. Inside, they started with the obvious: bedrooms, closets, bathrooms, but quickly moved into the less trafficked corners of the home. When they reached the basement, one detective noticed something peculiar along the back wall. The basement was half finished, one side concrete and storage, the other side carpeted, with beige walls and a few forgotten pieces of furniture. But along the far wall, behind a stack of plastic storage bins, there were sections of drywall that looked different. The paint was a shade too fresh. The seams too crisp. And when they tapped it, the sound was off, hollow, with an irregular echo. The lead investigator crouched down, running his fingers along the wall. The patching was recent. Very recent. With permission from the warrant, they cut into the drywall. Behind it, a narrow hidden alcove emerged. Inside, the space was small, maybe 3 feet deep, just enough for storage. Dust hung in the air as the beam from a flashlight swept across its contents. A purse. Not just any purse, Claire's purse. Inside it, her ID, credit cards, and driver's license, all neatly tucked away. Next to it, a set of clothes folded with care: jeans, a soft blue sweater, undergarments, as if prepared for a trip she never took. And then, a small notebook. The notebook's cover was worn, the edges slightly curled. Inside, the handwriting was unmistakably Claire's, neat, deliberate, and painfully detailed. Entry after entry documented months of physical and emotional abuse. Times and dates. Arguments that escalated into shouting. Shouting that escalated into something worse. Each page ended with the same haunting sign-off: Just in case something happens to me." The room went silent. Detectives glanced at each other, each understanding what they just found, not evidence of her death, but a chilling breadcrumb trail she had left behind, like she'd known this day might come. But there was one thing missing. Claire. They searched the rest of the house, the attic, the garage, the shed out back. Every square foot of the property was combed through, photographed, and logged. And yet, when the search concluded, there was no body. No sign of where she had gone, or been taken. The discovery in the basement deepened the mystery. If Claire had left voluntarily, why would she leave behind her purse? Her ID? Her clothes? And why, above all, would she leave a notebook that read like a final warning? When the team packed up that evening, the air outside felt heavier, as though the street itself was holding its breath. The case had shifted from a missing person to something darker. They had evidence. They had motive. They had suspicion. But until they found Claire, the truth was still out there, somewhere. In late January, the investigation into Claire Whitfield's disappearance had stalled again, not for lack of effort, but because the trail seemed to have gone cold. The search warrant had uncovered disturbing evidence in the basement, but without a body, prosecutors knew they were still working with a puzzle missing its most crucial piece. Then, the break came. It started with a phone call to the Ashford Police Department's tip line. The caller was a delivery driver from a regional appliance company. His voice was casual at first, but grew more urgent as he explained what he remembered. Early in January, right after New Year's, maybe the 3rd or 4th, he'd been dispatched to the Whitfield home to drop off a large, industrial-grade chest freezer. Michael Whitfield had met him in the driveway, waving him toward the garage. He'd been unusually specific about where he wanted it placed, against the back wall, near the outlet. And unlike most customers, he paid in cash. Crisp bills. No receipt requested. The driver remembered it clearly because, as he loaded the dolly back into the truck, Michael had said something odd. "This thing'll be sealed up tight. No kids messing around with it." At the time, it had seemed like an offhand remark. But in light of the news coverage about Claire, it suddenly felt different. Investigators took the tip seriously. On a frigid morning, they returned to the Whitfield home, this time in full force. Detectives, evidence techs, and uniformed officers poured into the driveway, their breath visible in the icy air. In the garage, there it was, the freezer. A hulking white rectangle, positioned exactly where the delivery driver had said. When officers tried to lift the lid, it wouldn't budge. The freezer had been bolted shut. A crowbar was brought in. The sound of metal groaning under force echoed through the garage. Finally, the bolts gave way. The lid creaked open, releasing a rush of cold air, and something else. Inside, wrapped in layer upon layer of heavy contractor plastic and bound with duct tape, was the unmistakable outline of a human form. The garage went silent. Even the hum of the freezer seemed louder in that moment. Detectives exchanged glances. This was no longer a missing person case. This was a homicide. The body was transported under heavy security to the medical examiner's office. The examination confirmed what investigators feared: it was Claire. She had suffered blunt force trauma to the head. The blow was fatal. Based on decomposition and body temperature, her death was estimated to have occurred on January 13th, the night before Michael had told friends, neighbors, and police that she'd left for Maine. With the body recovered, investigators began connecting the dots, and the picture that emerged was devastating. Claire's notebook, discovered in the basement alcove, became the emotional center of the case. Every page documented abuse, escalating over time. Then came the text messages to her sister, careful, coded warnings that hinted she was planning to leave. And the financial records, quietly obtained by subpoena, told their own story. In the weeks before Claire's disappearance, Michael had begun draining the couple's joint accounts, transferring the money into an account solely in his name. The timeline was painfully clear. Claire had been preparing to escape. Michael had found out. Prosecutors would later say it was premeditated, the purchase of the industrial freezer, the careful concealment, the shifting alibis. But in that moment, as officers processed the Whitfield garage, the focus was on one thing: preserving every scrap of evidence that would help tell Claire's story in court. Because Claire had done everything she could to warn the world, in her diary, in her texts, in the quiet courage of documenting her abuse, just in case something happens to me. Now, the world was finally listening. The trial of Michael Whitfield began almost exactly 1 year after the discovery in his garage. By then, the case had become a small-town obsession, not just in Ashford, but across Connecticut. Local news crews set up outside the courthouse every morning. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Rows of wooden benches creaked under the weight of neighbors, friends, and former co-workers, people who had once waved to Michael from across the street, shared meals with him at school fundraisers, or stood shoulder to shoulder with him in the pews on Sunday mornings. They came to see for themselves the man who, according to prosecutors, had murdered his wife, hidden her in a freezer, and carried on life as if nothing had happened. The prosecution's case was meticulous. They didn't just present evidence, they told a story. A story of a man obsessed with control. A man who valued the appearance of perfection above the reality of his marriage. A man who, when faced with the prospect of losing half his assets and the carefully cultivated image of his life, chose violence over vulnerability. The freezer delivery records. The bolted lid. The diary entries, projected onto a massive courtroom screen for the jury to see. And finally, the medical examiner's testimony, the blunt force trauma, the estimated time of death, the impossibility of Michael's version of events. Through it all, Michael sat motionless. No flinch when the freezer photos were shown. No change in expression when the prosecutor read aloud from Claire's final diary entries, words written in her own hand, her own ink, like whispers from the grave. When the defense tried to paint Claire as unstable, the jury's eyes flickered toward the gallery, where her sister Melanie sat with Emma and Noah, the children's small hands tucked inside hers. The attempt fell flat. After just 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The foreperson's voice was steady as they read the verdict. Guilty of murder in the first degree. Michael's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That was the only reaction he gave. Sentencing came quickly. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no second chance, no appeal for sympathy. The man who had once been the smiling, waving neighbor on Hawthorne Drive would spend the rest of his days behind bars. Emma and Noah were placed in the care of Claire's sister Melanie. The children's lives would never be the same, their home, their parents, their sense of safety all gone in one violent act. But Melanie promised them a home filled with honesty and love, the kind of love Claire had always tried to give. In the courtroom's final moments, the prosecutor placed one last image on the screen. It was a scan of the last page of Claire's diary, the page she had signed just days before her death. In neat handwriting, she had left behind words that now echoed through the silence of the room. If you're seeing this, I didn't make it out. Tell my children I love them more than anything. Some jurors wiped their eyes. Others stared at the floor. And outside, in the brittle winter air, the people of Ashford left the courthouse forever changed, not just by the horror of what had happened behind the Whitfield's perfect facade, but by the voice of a woman who had tried, in every way she could, to make sure her truth would one day be heard.